Up next, we have got Governing in the Shadow of the Smart Machine with Geoff Mulgan in conversation with Sir Nick Clegg and Tabitha Goldstaub. There will be questions, and we'll try and fit in as many as possible. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. Hopefully you are all keeping yourselves sufficiently cool with your improvised devices. We have no AI air conditioning, but I promise we will do next year, apparently, by Tabitha. So what we're going to be talking about in the next 45 minutes is really how we think about governing a world of smart machines, ubiquitous artificial intelligence. We are in this very extraordinary moment now, with a huge upsurge of excitement in AI, massive investment going in. In China, I was told provincial governments alone have committed $400 billion of investment in AI. Everywhere is wanting to be a global center in this. And at the same time, we have huge fears of job loss, fear of algorithms driving fake news, fear of losing out, and so on. And what we're going to try and explore is how to make sense of this. If you look back at past industrial revolutions, and many people say we are now going through a fourth industrial revolution, usually after a phase of dramatic technology change, there was then a phase of radical change to governance, complete change of institutions, the spread of, in the 19th century, of democracy, or in the 20th century, of welfare states, health services, new rules of the game. Partly because one effect of industrial revolutions is that a small minority benefit hugely, and the gains are very uneven, and people, not being completely stupid, they then campaign or fight to get a fairer share of the goods. So to help us navigate through this, we have Nick Clegg, well known, I hope, to all of you, former Deputy Prime Minister, also someone who knows European institutions very well, which may play the crucial role in this space. And he's been quite active today on the media on Brexit, which I think we're not going to talk about at all, except insofar as it relates to this question. And then Tabitha, who organizes the amazing CogX event, not very long ago here in London, but has just recently become essentially the person in charge of this whole field in government, overseeing the Office of AI. So, perfect people to help us through these questions. So I'm going to start with Nick, just to give us a sense, really from an experience as a very senior serving politician, commentator, writer, thinker. How do you think we should be thinking about this question?
Well, I mean, you've captured it brilliantly. I've got not very much to add, other than the fact that it does seem to me obvious that much as societies have had to ready themselves in the past, physically, in terms of our infrastructure, ethically, institutionally, legally, regulatorily, for new technological convulsions, whether it's the age of electricity or the age of oil. We're clearly now in the foothills of a new age of data, which will touch every aspect of our lives, and already is in so many respects. And we are only at the very, very beginning of having debates at places like this about how we have to completely overhaul, in my view, almost every aspect of the way in which we run our economy, run our democracy, run our public services, and so on. And I start from a sort of intuitive optimism about the kind of progressive potential and promise of technological change. But I'm equally fearful of the tendency, and you referred to it yourself, Geoff, for politicians, not least on behalf of anxious, unsettled voters who are unsettled by all sorts of changes to the way in which they work, they live, they consume, change which they don't fully understand. I'm fearful that far from sort of taking this moment to anticipate the future in a deliberative, consensual, and logical manner, that instead, human nature being what it is, democracy being the higgledy-piggledy thing that it is, the vested interests, old vested interests being what they are. I mean, do not underestimate at the moment the powerful role played by old-fashioned vested interests, notably but not exclusively in the newspaper industry, who loathe some of this technological revolution because it's, certainly in the case of social media, destroying their whole business model. So they are every day, of course, filling their news pages, read in turn by millions of voters, communicated in turn to politicians. They are constantly mining this rich seam of the dark side of technological change. So as much as I'm optimistic about the future, what the age of data can do for the way in which we learn, the way in which we consume, the way in which we interact, the way in which we communicate, perhaps most especially the way in which we also keep ourselves healthy. I mean, the impact on healthcare in itself would warrant a whole week's worth of these kind of discussions. I'm equally sort of mindful of the fact that it could go off, it could spiral off in the wrong direction, and actually that mixture of sort of fear and ignorance leads to misplaced regulation and heavy-handed legislation. And in this sort of age of political populism, I think people underestimate, particularly those on the kind of more utopian sort of Silicon Valley sort of side of the tech ecosystem, where, you know, they've come up with these great things on their T-shirts in their garage, and, hey, progress is unstoppable, and it'll all be great and wonderful if only just politicians would get out of their way. I think they sometimes forget, particularly in an age of populism, that progress can be stopped. It can be halted, it can be slowed down, it can be warped by bad decisions by governments doing stupid things. And I think that is quite a risk at the moment. So I guess my interest is, because I'm not going to pretend that I have some great, I've tried to learn quite a lot since I left office 3 years ago about the kind of tech world, but I'm not going to pretend I'm a tech expert. But I am fascinated by the interaction, or what can more appropriately be described as the collision between the tech world and politics at the moment. And if we mishandle that collision, what you'll get this dialogue of people talking past each other, where you'll get sort of naivety and utopianism from the tech side, and kind of fear and ignorance from the political side. And that could at its worst lead to a squandering of the potential, the progressive potential of the tech revolution in which we are in the early stages. So my interest is how is almost an exercise in translation. How do you get these two worlds, which are talking past each other, to talk to each other in a way which can help frame, because we will have to introduce new regulation. This idea that it's a libertarian free-for-all is a nonsense. Of course, as you quite rightly said, you will get some kind of regulation. How do we frame it intelligently so we get the best out of tech and don't instead harvest the worst?
Just before I bring Tabitha in, just a very simple question. In fields like health and education, as you said, it's quite easy to see the many ways in which data and AI can make things dramatically better. So far, just in the world of politics and the media and how they interact, on balance, has the advent of much more powerful data tools and AI done more good or more harm, just so far?
In practice?
In practice, yeah.
I think it's done more good.
More good?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Despite Cambridge Analytica or all those other things?
Yeah, well, we might come on to that. I look at my own view for what it's worth, not least because of various odd reasons I know some of the characters involved. I think there's been quite a lot of spivvy over-claiming about, listen, people trying to sell their wares like to sort of portray themselves as stroking a white cat in an all-controlling office somewhere called Cambridge Analytica.
That's not true.
And we all haplessly do what these dastardly... It's not... I actually don't think their influence was nearly... It could be, and we'll come on to that. I think there are certain things that tech could do and can do to distort democracy. I actually think what it has done so far in this country has been overstated.
Yeah. So Tabitha, part of your role is helping to make sure that government understands the perspectives of a much more knowledgeable industry. You've obviously got the risk of conversations passing each other completely, as Nick said. How are you seeing the possibilities now?
Yeah, I think Nick beautifully framed exactly what I am now in the middle of, and I'm really excited to be here. Not least because I feel like we're on the pyramid stage at Glastonbury, but because I look around and I think that it's the people in this room that are going to make sure that we can make the most of what potentially, as you just described, could be a squandering of the opportunity. And it's worth talking a little bit about the role that I have, the mantle I've picked up. So our business, Cognition X, our job really in life is to try and unleash the power of artificial intelligence and rapidly, as well as responsibly, get companies to start deploying AI. And so it's a natural fit for me to be championing, and as you just said, probably slightly naively optimistic, and then try and make sure that we can bring those two things together with what government's thinking about. And so the Office for AI, for those of you who don't know, was set up by DCMS and BEIS, which is a joint department, which is quite rare, isn't it, where they come together. And the AI Council, which I'm the chair of, will be advising that group of civil servants. And our job, I feel quite strongly about, starts with holding government to account on some of the promises and commitments that were made in the sector deal, and unlocking industry. So rather than us thinking that these things can be done by government who, as you say, aren't the tech savviest, or by industry, this hopefully, at each point, we can bring these two groups together to have discussions, have debate, and if we can get the right people who potentially haven't spent time with government before, I'm the newest newbie, maybe we get some fresh thinking that hasn't been so jaded by some of the things that have not worked in the past. And that's really what I'm trying to do, and bring together incredible minds. So I'm very lucky that Demeter Sabas is advising us, Dame Wendy Hall, who wrote the report. And effectively, the job now is to run as fast as we can, but as carefully as we can. So what I've seen in terms of, Facebook's, run fast and break things, I think that's no longer something we can say and be proud of. We need to move very quickly but carefully. And if I can do anything about that, that's what I kind of spent my waking moments thinking about.
So you've got some promises from government in terms of things like spending money and R&D and skills and so on. In terms of the rules and regulations, what do you most hope for and what do you most fear that government could get wrong?
I think the biggest fear is the fear itself. So even the title of this talk was like, smart machines in the shadow. How are we in the shadow of these smart machines? And I think my big fear is that we don't see this as like man, woman, and machine coming together. And we keep painting, as the newspapers are, this like doom and gloom. Every time we talk to journalists, we give them as many pictures as we can of AI, any picture. I mean, literally, there's a whole agency that makes beautiful pictures, and every time it's Terminator. Every single time. And there's nothing you can do about it at the moment. So I have a big concern about that. I'm also concerned that we don't regulate enough, and people lose all sense of personal identity and have no concept that data is part of their personal identity, and that's a massive risk. So basically, both sides scare me. I shouldn't say scare me. Both sides concern me.
So the word artificial, of course, means human-made, which is the paradox of this discussion. AI is human-made intelligence, not something which comes from outer space. One of the sort of shadows which does, I think, hang over this debate is if you look at where money went into AI for the last 50 years, huge amounts went in the military or in surveillance, in essentially ways for big business or big government to control people, almost nothing to do the opposite. And indeed, AI for better purposes in health and education is now beginning to get little bits of funding, but dramatically less than those others. So a starting point, what would a good it's almost allocation of public money be in AI, because it's not one that any group of the public would have wanted in the past, I suspect. Smart missiles rather than smart healthcare.
I mean, you've answered the question. We should be spending money on how data can help rehabilitate a broken social care system rather than improve citizen surveillance. We should be using data to, as leading companies like DeepMind have been trying to. Yeah. They've encountered certain controversies, but I broadly think they're trying to do the right thing by applying these new these new methods and applying machine learning to completely transforming diagnostic medicine. But everything from traffic flow to dealing with crime. I mean, so many public goods can be, in my view, strengthened and qualitatively improved by the intelligent and progressive use of data. And that's, of course, where government should be putting its shoulder to the wheel. I mean, it's actually interesting point, almost by anecdote. I first developed an interest in all of this, not because when I was for 5 years in government, I found that ministers from the Department for Education or the Department of Health came to me and said, we really should be doing more on AI and the classroom. No, I first developed an interest in it because I had a long battle of attrition with Theresa May, because she and the Home Office kept wanting to aggregate ever more data for what I thought ever more random and possibly illiberal, for something which is now past history, but it was dubbed the so-called Snoopers Charter, which I sort of blocked for the 5 years I was in government, because I was totally unconvinced that was an appropriate use or aggregation of data on a vast scale. And that's when I first came across it. And then I went and spoke to the spooks and went and spoke to the folk at Silicon Valley. And I realized that the sort of securocrats, particularly in the Home Office, and understandably, that's what they're paid for, only saw the kind of data revolution as a better way of spreading the net ever more widely about information held on everybody, both whether they're guilty or innocent. But what was interesting was that my experience over half a decade was that the bit of Whitehall whose reflexes were most, perhaps too trigger happy, were in the security bit of it, not the public. Oddly enough, the sort of public service facing departments were more backward looking and more small c conservative, oddly enough.
And that's probably partly a reflection of capability. They just had more people who were used to spending money on technology, commissioning, procuring. We have GCHQ and all sorts of very institutions full of smart people. What's been your experience of, this is maybe an unfair question, but of all the skill, the capability within government to be smart governors of AI, or indeed procurers or commissioners?
Yeah. I think what I've seen is a renewed willingness from government in general, so I'm definitely not talking politics here, but government in general, to talk to the people who do have the smarts. And I think part of my job, hopefully, is to open that door wider. So the civil servants and GDS don't need to become the be-all and end-all experts, because we will go and work with the government. And I myself am not a practitioner. I'm not an engineer. I feel like I need to make sure that we find those practitioners and engineers that are willing and able.
Are you sending them on training courses, anything like that?
Well, I'm personally not doing any of those things, but I would definitely suggest things like that. What I'm excited about is the Grand Challenge in health. So the Grand Challenge is the one for AI is specifically focused on health, and what I'm hoping it does is catalyze both government to have to work with business that want to try and make sure that we can live healthier, longer, happier lives. That should be a good enough reason for government to have to start to understand these things at a much deeper level.
In a few minutes, we're going to turn to your Slido comments or questions. So turn to Slido, start thinking about what you want to ask. Not yet, but get warmed up. And just before we do, a couple of other fields I want to cover. One is geopolitics. So how many people in this room have been in some way affected by GDPR this year? Does this affect any of your lives? No, not at all, clearly. No. So the EU is a crucial player in this space. Dramatic new laws around data have been brought in. Some people say, in relation to AI, Europe will be a regulatory superpower, but in every other respect, third, certainly behind the US and China, and possibly well behind Canada, India, and other countries. Do you think Europe is getting that balance right of protecting personal data, but also allowing the kind of data sharing and analysis which gives you the benefits in health or education? Or is Europe going to look like it's getting this dramatically wrong? Nick?
I certainly think that's an accurate characterization of where Europe seems to be heading. I mean, Europe is not remotely on the par with the customer-facing genius of California, and clearly not on a par, and never will be, with the sheer scale of data that can be accrued without any compunction about privacy and data protection and so on in China. And clearly they're using that very, very aggressively to excel, particularly in the area of AI. But you're right, the European Union does nonetheless play a very important agenda-setting role as a sort of norm setter. And so Europe's challenge is how to match its sort of norm-setting clout with ingenuity and commercial success at scale. And that's been I spent 10 years 5 years in the European Commission, 5 years in the European Parliament. I sat through endless seminars, people asking, why do we not have a Google? Why do we not have a Facebook? Why can't we? And that's a whole lot of complex reasons for that. We don't really have a digital single market. We don't really have an integrated consumer market digitally yet. We have sort of little blobs of brilliance. Universities doing some of the most groundbreaking stuff, small startup companies doing the groundbreaking stuff, but they tend to get gobbled up by the larger ones as founders kind of basically move on to do other things. And we certainly don't have the reservoir of data to play with, and I'm not sure as a continent we would want to anyway, that the Chinese do presently. So I think it's, I would say this, wouldn't I? And I promise you I won't mention the B word, Brexit, I said it. But you can't, in my view, as a continent, and we're a sort of cluttered patchwork continent, you can't get the best out of all of this for us as a continent unless you do it collectively. Yes, of course, there's always a danger that Brussels institutions left to themselves will come up with inappropriate regulation. Some people here will have positive views of GDPR, other people have negative. I don't think there's any evidence, by the way, whatever your views are, that GDPR is the reason why AI is not flourishing on the scale that it is in California or in parts of China. None at all. I personally think it's actually, broadly speaking, the right thing to do, and I think other jurisdictions will emulate it. The trick remains an old problem, is how do we take all those blobs of brilliance and make them the sum of their parts? That's what we're poor at in Europe, and it's of course not helped if we're pulling away from each other.
And how do you see the geopolitics of this? And maybe talk about the UK. You have a UK role rather than a European one. Are we going in different directions already?
I think having a UK role means I have a European role and then a global role. I don't see this as UK must win, and that's a lot of the rhetoric that has been coming out. UK's leading, and I think I would much rather we kind of all held hands and went together. And I think there's this whole survival of the fittest moment right now, where everyone's going, well, if we're not the best, then will we not survive? And I think we don't need to be the what even best means. What we need to do is work out what the UK can uniquely be very good at, and then start partnering with Europe and with each individual country and work out, okay, what are you going to be the best at? And actually, yesterday the French and the British government had I'm not going to be able to say it, but a French colloquy, basically like became friends in French, and well, someone told me it was like dorm room for like dorm mates. Anyway. There's a new data sharing. There's new the Entrepreneur First have just set up a new group in Paris, and so I think what we need to do is work out where will GDPR give us an edge over the rest of the world, and where will we work with the rest of the world to explain how we think. We've always been quite good at, as you said, regulation and assurance. And potentially that means that this can become somewhere where AI comes through. There's a chance where businesses want to come to the UK to have their AI assured. Potentially. There's some really, I think, clever moves we can make now, as long as we don't see it as UK leading and the rest behind. We have to see it as us all doing this together.
Yeah, and that's probably the lesson of financial services is one that good regulation is good for your industry, and ideally your good regulation is aligned with others, doesn't make you too different from that, which is kind of obvious. But
I think you described what I was trying to say better. Yeah, exactly.
And is there again?
And I'm just to say, I mean, people have forgotten, but for a while, Europe, particularly Scandinavian companies, were world beaters in the first mobile telecommunications revolution, Nokia, Ericsson, and so on. Yeah. And that was in large part because of a regulatory sort of lead that Europe took, the GSM sort of standards at the time. I'm not sure if it's a perfect analogy for what's happening now, but it's not as if this sort of old continent of ours hasn't been able to produce world beaters in new technologies. We did it quite recently.
Yeah, mobile phones, Northern Europe jumped ahead of the US through setting common standards through government, which may well have some parallels here. Can I just go to some of the laws? We're beginning just to start seeing new institutions being created, new laws. So France has a fake news law, went through their parliament, I think, last month, trying to govern the sort of algorithms which led Facebook to spread fake news. That will become illegal, something that's a very over-draconian response. Here in the UK, the government is setting up a centre for data ethics and innovation to be not a regulator, but a kind of, where do you see this whole field going of really innovation in law and institutions to deal with a multitude of new challenges coming from AI? Nick?
I think you have to sort of disaggregate it a bit. The focus of those measures hasn't really been about AI as such. It's been about the ability for, via social media, messages to be targeted with great precision, at great speed, without any distinction really between whether they're true or false. And I mean, the first thing to say is this is not new. The idea that people fib, I mean, that hasn't been invented by Mark Zuckerberg. And in the electoral system, politicians have always targeted voters. I mean, when I used to sort of knock on doors in southwest Sheffield, you'd go out with your clipboard and your pen with a rosette in your rain-soaked jacket, sort of, and you'd immediately make an assessment, judging by what car they've got, what their drive looks like, or what part of town it is, what way you might think they vote, and then you kind of decide, what message might work for them best. Is it about the local bus stop, or is it about crime? So none of that is new. What is new is the sheer scale and velocity
and it was bragged about a few years ago. So Obama and others bragged about how well they did that targeting.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's nothing. I mean, I do think some people are getting. I mean, it's sort of moving from piety to cant, really. I mean, so what do people expect in electoral contest? You are trying to talk people's language and trying to interest them in things that are rooted in their life. So you have to try and make some assessment about who they are. So social media has been able to completely revolutionize that, but not qualitatively. I think it's sort of quantitatively. Now, as you know, the newspaper response is, so Zuckerberg should be treated just like the editor of The Sun or The Mail or whatever, all those great paragons of truth and objectivity. I'm quite ambivalent about this. I just think it's self-evidently nonsense, the idea that in Palo Alto they should be responsible for everything that 2 billion people put up on their Facebook pages. On the other hand, they themselves have already conceded that they have a role in content because they employ scores, more and more of these so-called moderators who do take stuff down, and sometimes they get the decisions right, sometimes they don't. I personally think a lot of this might be quite an unfashionable thing to say, should be thrown back at the politicians and parliaments. You should say, okay, you guys legislate for what you think is or is not appropriate, or is or isn't legal, and then you enforce the law. But don't divest from yourself the responsibility to adjudicate on what you think is or isn't permissible, and sort of put it on the shoulders of private sector profit-making companies. That's not what they're there for. We shouldn't expect that of them. So it might be slightly odd for me to say this, sort of having come from the political realm. I honestly think in this debate at the moment, I wish the politicians would take more responsibility than constantly assuming that someone somewhere will come up with some whiz-bang answer to a very, very old problem of people spreading falsehoods.
A liberal view from a liberal politician.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I feel like there is a whiz-bang answer, which was just advertising standards. So used to be in online video, and I couldn't advertise things unless there was a whole set of rules that I went through. Why aren't politicians governed by the Advertising Standards Authority?
Well, I certainly think, by the way, and I think there are now moves afoot, certainly in the States, I'm not sure here, to make sure that it will no longer be possible to receive messages for political intentions without it being made transparent who's paid for it and why. And I think, I don't know, I'm not here to speak for all the social media companies, I'm assuming they would welcome that. So
I think
you can do a whole bunch on transparency. That's the low-hanging fruit. And that's happening, and if it isn't happening, it should happen and happen more quickly. I think, but, remember, we're moving to a world now where, I saw a demonstration the other day from a company, a British-based company, that is using machine learning to basically mimic autonomously, with no human intervention, video clips of sort of Donald Trump declaring nuclear war on Belgium, for instance. And if you watch the clip, it's his voice, it's his mannerisms. It's impossible to distinguish between truth and falsehoods. I don't have the answer to that. How you legislate against that degree of sophistication.
Okay, I'm going to open up to semi-democracy now, because various of you have been asking questions on Slido, which will hopefully appear on the screen. And I think I'll start with the biggest one in a way, which is should government ensure the rewards of AI and data are not concentrated in a few big companies, but spread in some way? There was a fascinating piece a few months ago which Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote, trying to answer that question from an economic point of view. It's about the first piece I've ever seen trying to look at how do the winners, to some extent, compensate the losers. Where will all this go? In some ways, his argument was there will be net productivity gains, huge gains from AI, but how do we ensure they're not all captured by relatively small groups? There is some compensation for the millions who will lose their jobs and suffer harm in some way. Who would like to start on that very small question? Tabitha.
I think I'm going to go with my gut instinct on where there's a quick win, which is around unlocking more data safely, so that then smaller companies who don't have access to all of this data are able to be as ingenious, as smart, and you need a certain number of people to build an AI system, but actually in order to win you need the big data sets. And so finding ways, and I think this is somewhere where government can help, where we do safely unlock more data, and the data trusts is one of the sector deals kind of big focuses, so that then we're not stuck with this sort of haves and have-nots of data. The second thing I think is if government can encourage individuals to value their data more. So, our data is effectively a currency, and we need to see it as a currency, and we need to feel a sense of ownership of how much data we're giving out, and we need to feel that we should get something in return. And I think that if we could, and I don't want to go into why it's going to be very difficult, but if you could find a way, then there would be then more data for more companies rather than just the data for the big tech giants.
And we have the data casino just out there, which is entirely about that concept.
Data casino, I would lose all my money. I'm like, go big on the data casino,
But I think actually the UK is leading the world on your first point, which is ways of opening up data, which is being done on banking, which at least levels the playing field between the big players and the small ones. Nick?
Yeah, no, I think there are three, there are lots of aspects, but there are three big aspects I would single out. One is data, who controls it, who owns it, how is it shared, how is it made accessible to others, and I won't repeat what you've said. The second one is just size, and there's an endless debate amongst much cleverer people than me about whether there are certain sort of so-called network effects, which just mean that once you're a sort of early mover in dominating the search engine market for what it's worth, it's just incredibly difficult to produce rival competitors to Google beyond a certain. But there are network effects which make it, whatever the competition authorities say, lend those services to a great size. And I have some sympathy with that it's quite difficult to disaggregate some of the technology with the size. Where I have much less sympathy with the big companies is the way they gobble up anything that sort of shimmers and shines and might look like a really good, useful product, or worse still, when they gobble up something which might be a direct competitor to them. And that's where I think competition authorities can just straightforwardly say, no, you just can't buy that up. You're big enough as it is. Yeah. And there's a big difference in philosophy between Europe and America. American competition policy orthodoxy basically says, and here I'm simplifying all sorts of legality in a very sort of Philistine way, but basically says that competition authorities shouldn't intervene unless there's clear evidence, prima facie evidence of damage to consumers and higher prices. European competition authorities, that's why Margaret Vestager, the Danish competition commissioner, is such a sort of bête noire for Silicon Valley, is saying, no, hang on a minute, competition is in and of itself a good thing. And so I do think you could, I think I have some sympathy with the network effect argument, I have much more sympathy. And then there's tax. There's just tax, it's just straightforward, good old-fashioned tax. And then a bit like the argument we had earlier, I mean, everyone can, of course, and we can all do it, and it all makes us all feel very good to say, oh, isn't it ghastly, these companies should pay more tax. But at the end of the day, again, it's up to governments, and particularly governments internationally, to just set the bleeding rules. Just set the rules so that they can't play cat and mouse with tax authorities. They're under a sort of fiduciary duty, a lot of these big companies, to find the best shareholder value. So of course they're going to seek out perfectly legally tax-efficient ways of doing things. And at the end of the day, we can constantly berate them for doing that, but they will carry on doing it because that's in their commercial DNA, and no one should be surprised by that. But equally, it should be in the DNA of governments to do something about it. And I do find it very frustrating to see governments at international level simply not cooperating together on the fiscal side of things. You could relatively quickly capture a lot more tax from this activity and then, in answer to this question, devote it to other benefits to society if only governments got together to do it internationally.
President Macron is attempting ideas in that space. Just on the competition point, some would argue the digital world creates a different order of monopoly than the world of manufacturing. And indeed, at the moment, I think a quarter of all mergers and acquisition spend is in digital as companies buy up the newcomers. But that artificial intelligence amplifies that even more because the value of training data at scale is so much bigger. Should we expect, other things being equal, even more concentration of corporate power in a mature AI economy than in the digital economy? Just on balance, other things being equal. Do you think that's a fair assumption, Tabitha?
I think unless we can get more smart, unless we can get better investment in the UK that allows businesses to keep growing and supports businesses growing beyond, either through IPO or as independent, I think that is a really big risk.
And is that your assumption or not?
Again, I'll defer to people here. I'm told that some of the greatest innovations in AI now is that AI certain deployments of AI are being successfully deployed on much narrower sets of data. In other words, this assumption that you need ever exponentially expanding reservoirs of data doesn't appear to be true. That seems to me to be of profound significance. In other words, if you're able to deploy the genius of these pattern recognizing algorithms on smaller sets of data, then the argument that you need to gobble up your competitors to accrue more data starts collapsing. And again, I defer to others here, but I'm told that blockchain technology also holds out the possibility of being able to sort of decentralize control over data in a way that hasn't been the case. So who knows, maybe developments within the AI industry itself will negate the need to become bigger and bigger and bigger, to have control over ever greater pots of data.
Yeah. I'm going to turn to the next question, which is, again, a massive question, but a very good one. Given our short-term political cycles, how can our political class understand the long-term ramifications of decisions made on AI? Now, you might ask, how can anyone know the long-term ramifications given the uncertainties? But perhaps I might ask each of you to comment on how should we be having this debate? Involving the political class, involving the public, so we at least try and explore those ramifications and don't just wait for things to happen to us. What would be a really healthy sort of version of this debate in a year or two's time here in Britain? How would it be structured? You're going to be partly responsible for that, aren't
that's
you?
what I was worried about. I was like, that's a really good question. I need to solve for that. That is, if I take it into two parts, and I think about, there's the political cycles, which I think is probably one of the most complicated things across all technology. And then there's the fact that it's very hard to predict where AI is going. You've got this double challenge. I think the only way to do it, and again, I hope this doesn't sound too naive, but it is getting the public to care, because that then means that whatever politicians in place will then have to, if they want to get voted in, actually go for what the public cares about. And it's actually Future First and other things where we are now engaging enough with the general public is probably our best route to making sure that people do think about the long-term ramifications, and then don't act politically, but they act in the best interest of the public. That would be my hope, is that everybody in this room, and then you go home and you tell 10 people, and they tell 10 people, and we all care, like we care whether or not, Starbucks it has got good ethics, like we start to care. And then the politicians will have to listen to us.
Nick?
Look, I don't think, short-term political cycles, that's just the nature of democracy. And I've had private conversations with senior Chinese leaders who basically slightly giggle behind their hands and say, you guys are stuffed because we can plan for the long term. We don't have to worry about, scurrying off to voters every few years. You guys just are not. So there's it's a very insightful question to which there's not an easy answer. I think part of the answer, exactly as Tabitha just described, is to seek to build up a sense of optimism and excitement about the long-term potential of what AI and this data revolution can bring. At the moment, the dominant emotional kind of prism through which it's seen is fear, anxiety, uncertainty, anger, and in politics, you have this unholy alliance, in my judgment, between the kind of criticism from the left, which is that it's all some dystopian, capitalist, ghastly, voraciously profit-making plot hatched up by unaccountable squillionaires in Silicon Valley who don't give a about the small people, and then a view from the right, which is it's going to unpick good old traditional values of family, hierarchy, royalty, nation, flag, and so on. And they're feeding off each other, and they're being very, very deliberately played, frankly, by these old vested interests. And I've only been out of Parliament for a short period of time, but even I've noticed now, if you're a jobbing backbencher, doesn't matter which party it is, all you need to do at the moment, if you stub your toe in your bathroom in the morning, all you need to do is bash out a press release and say, ow, my toe hurts, it's Mark Zuckerberg's fault. And you're guaranteed full-page coverage on page 2 of the Daily Mail, page 3 of the Times and the Sun, and so on. So this feeds off itself. So you've got the right and the left who've got their narrative against tech. You've got these vested interests who've got it, and you've got politicians on the make who obviously want to get their moment in the sun. It's a really dangerous cocktail, and I think it can only be replaced by good old-fashioned leadership, but also people buying into the positive long-term potential of the kind of tech revolution. And that is completely missing in the political and public debate at the moment.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for a debate which will run and run. But just before we close, perhaps a quick, almost mood check on Nick's final point, just to see who's in this room. On balance, are you basically optimistic we will get the benefits of AI, we will solve enough of the governance problems that there is a sunlit upland there? Or do you, on balance, think the dark forces, the threats, the negatives will win out? So first of all, show of hands, who's on the positive, optimistic, hope side?
Such a representative audience.
Who is on the sort of fear, negativity, horror side? Okay, this afternoon, hope is winning.
But it should be in a place like this.
But you're obviously completely unrepresentative of your fellow citizens. On that hopefully positive note, can I thank Nick and Tabitha for really insightful comments. And this is a debate we really have to generalize and make truly inclusive in the next year or two. And thank God we've got someone who's got that as their job description. Thank you.
Thank you.